her research.
Cool.
Yeah, using cyber operations and online influence campaigns to invest in cyber humanitarian. That's my just
That's a really,
That's
that's a really good element. Teaching that. I didn't realize if you work on my own, that takes for all my research.
yeah, go now, you're done. Yeah.
No, but there's actually a link between NYU, Cornell Tech, UT, Columbia. There's and then also just the private sector stuff. There's a really good together socially and all fun stuff. Anya Schifrin, yeah.
That'd be great. Going around this way.
But they're really cool. So in addition, there's like a fun digital forensics. Yeah.
Also, nailed it.
Some experience, some computational.
We just like I get that vibe. Yeah. The two of them, it's like that.
Exactly.
Which is really fun. It's nice to think about.
You get it. You're a doer. You'll get it done. We can share. We can share. Yeah, no, we can share. Right? 1, 2, 3, yeah.
Well, I because of my work, my definitions are good.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to have you guys on this beautiful spring morning. It's like they say in Scotland, no bad weather, just wrong clothes. So I hope that you stay dry and warm, and if it's any consolation, on Monday and Tuesday it's going to be beautiful. So. It's great to open day 2 with you. This is a panel that's entitled Generative AI, Online Misinformation and Disinformation, and Risks of Political Violence in Key 2024 Elections. Before I introduce our panelists, I mean, one thing that for me, and is the thinking behind this panel is that I think a lot of us have consumed a lot of mainstream media and maybe some specialized media stories about the risks of artificial intelligence generated misinformation in upcoming campaigns. They are often, they're ubiquitous, and I have found a lot of them not particularly illuminating, to be honest. Especially when it comes to what these emerging information technologies how they can also be leveraged for progressive, preventative ends, and not just seen as some dark looming cloud that's coming for us all. And so in selecting in inviting the panelists, I really wanted people from different sectors of, broadly speaking, the prevention community, from academic and NGO and activist sectors to help us talk through what we should be thinking about, what we should be paying attention to. Certainly in our own upcoming election, where online disinformation, and election interference is already in full swing, but also in a comparative sense in other national elections, where the process of democratic backsliding also carries known and perhaps some less known risks of large-scale political violence. And so, once again, in typical Frontiers of Prevention way, we haven't coordinated at all, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing what these people are up to, what they do, and having them talk to one another before we talk to you about their work and their thoughts about the theme of the panel. So on my far left is Ziv Sanderson, who is the founding executive director of New York University's NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. In this role, Zev helps lead the center's strategy, operations, and management. His research interests focus on measuring the diffusion and impact of harmful online speech, as well as empirically testing the efficacy of interventions. He speaks regularly to academic, media, and government audiences, and his writing has appeared in both popular and scholarly outlets. He's actually writing a dissertation at the Free University of Amsterdam, which is quite interesting. Next to him is, well, actually, where's Heather? Sorry, I have to scroll through this and find all these files. Well, I'll introduce Brianna first. Brianna Nielsen is here. Thank you. Is the Cybersecurity Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, CSAC. Her research focuses on new technologies and conflict, specifically cyber, social media, and AI, mass atrocities, misinformation, disinformation, and the ethics of war. While at CSAC, Rhiannon is working on her project Algorithms for Atrocity Prevention, where she argues for using cyber humanitarian interventions and online influence operations to protect populations from mass atrocities, including genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Her published work has appeared in journals such as International Affairs, Terrorism and Political Violence, and Ethics in International Affairs. Most recently, she has published in Lawfare on the Russia-Ukraine project. Next to me is Dr. Chinasa Tiagolo, who is a fellow in the Center for Technology and Innovation in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institute, and a recent computer science PhD graduate from Cornell University in my town. Her research focuses on AI governance in emerging markets, AI literacy upskilling, human-centered approaches to AI explainability, the future of data work, and leveraging AI to advance global health. At Cornell, Dr. Ogolo's dissertation research incorporated ethnographic methods to understand how frontline healthcare workers in rural India perceive and value AI. Her work also examined how explainability can best be leveraged in AI-enabled technologies deployed throughout the global south with focus on healthcare. Outside of her dissertation focus, she's also conducted research examining the effective adoption and successful implementation of AI in Africa, COVID-19 misinformation spread on social networks within African communities, and the impact of generative AI within Africa. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Heather Ashby. Dr. Ashby is experienced in national and foreign policy with a focus on Russia, including its relationship with countries in the global south. She was named a 2018 Top 35 Black American National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation Leader by New America. Former Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation member, and co-chair for the Redefining National Security Intersectionality Sub-Working Group, and WCCAP's program leader for Gen Z program, and has been a Morin Fellow alumni to Moscow, Russia. I didn't get into your bio the work that you were doing for US IP, so would like to talk about that too. So enough introductions. I'd just like to do the thing where the moderator asks a sort of a initial question and then sits back and watches what happens. So we've been chatting a bit about this, and I think, Zev, you were suggesting, and I couldn't agree more, that one way to start us off, given the range of expertise on this panel, is to help us disambiguate a little bit what we mean when we're talking about generative AI in these contexts of misinformation, disinformation, and atrocity risk. Because a lot of us in the civilian world have a very uneducated view of like this dark blob, amorphous blob of bad technology that's coming to get us all. And that seems to be extremely unhelpful. So maybe I could just take a few minutes and start with you, Zev, and just move this direction. When you, in the work that you are currently doing, what is the working definition for generative AI that you're using? How do you think about these the particular relevance of this technology for the work that you're doing, like right now, like this month, so to speak?
Sure. So I'm going to pass it over to you pretty quickly because you came with the government definitions of AI. But I think I think that there's a quip which I mentioned in the email from the computer scientists that AI is just what hasn't been done yet. And what I think what that is gesturing at is that there's like a fuzziness around what people refer to as AI. I think at a high level, the way that we think about it is that like it's a set of technologies that allow computers to simulate human intelligence or human thinking. I think simulate is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that definition. And for the generative piece, what we're focusing on, at least in our research, is mostly on large language models and so the ability for machines to produce what feels like human-like text from human-like speech in text form from sort of human-like speech inputs, and that sort of input-output pair is really interesting. We've done more work recently on multimodal generative AI, so the ability to take in sort of human-like speech and then produce whether it's videos, audio, images, which I'll have you to talk about more, but I wanted to pass things over since you came prepared with the
Yeah, so my current work, I used to work for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I was in the Center for Russia and Europe working on Russian activities in different parts of the world, including Ukraine, which is not really an activity, it's an invasion, an act of aggression, as well as transitioning within USIP to working on technology issues. So studying Russia, I was looking at Russian influence operations, and we released a report last year looking at Russian influence operations in Latin America. And so that's just an initial overview of what are some of the things that in the information space, but the companies they have, the individuals who've been set in Latin America for decades, engaged in activities to form a relationship with elites and so forth to advance Russia's interests. But now I work for a company that's contracted supporting the US government, and part of that work is looking at AI. And so what would be interesting for some people, if you want to know what the US government is doing for AI outside of like very secretive ways, because that's hard to get to, is it's a website called ai.gov. And one of the things that the Biden administration, through their executive order that came out in October of last year on AI, was saying that the US government needs to publicize some of its use cases of AI across the government. And so if you have interest in understanding, say, how the Department of Homeland Security, other government agencies are encountering and dealing with AI, which has been going on for years, that's a good place to start if you're just trying to wrap your mind around it, as well as what are some of the rules around AI use within the federal government. And so my definition comes from that executive order, even though for a couple of years now, under the previous administration, there were efforts to codify into law what is the US government definition of AI and different categories of machine learning and applications of AI. So this is from the executive order, and it's a definition for AI is a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. Artificial intelligence systems use machine and human-based inputs to perceive real and virtual environments. And so what that really means is we're feeding information and data. And so another thing that I think would be helpful to engage is just data, lots of data. And where that data is coming from, how we provide it to ways that, to the government, to companies, and how that's being used in these systems or for other purposes.
Thanks so much, everyone, and again, thanks so much, Max, for the invitation. I'm honored to be on this panel with such leading experts, and I just wanted to quickly echo Heather said something very briefly about use case, and I think for me, when we talk about artificial intelligence, people do have this image a lot of the time of a kind of nebulous third-party entity that's kind of come in and have agency, which is not at all what artificial intelligence is. Really, what we're talking about is use cases, and this differs pretty drastically in terms of what you want to use artificial intelligence for. It could be for very positive ends, it could be for very negative ends. A lot of what has been garnering attention in the media recently is use cases of artificial intelligence for military decision making and for target selection. I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of this in the discussion, but there was a report recently released regarding the Israeli Defense Forces uses of these technologies in Gaza. So we've got what's called the gospel, and this is the use of data, predictive modeling to select targets like buildings, military objectives within Gaza. Lavender, which is the selection of military combatants, so those who would be liable to being targeted. And again, this is based on a wide range of synthesis of information that goes into identifying those targets. And then a third entity of artificial intelligence, which is pretty grotesquely named Where's Daddy? And the idea there is once they've used Lavender to identify who could be a military target, they then wait until that individual has gone home to their families because it is easier to target individuals within that time. So the IDF has not confirmed that this is what they're using, but this is a report that had come out detailing at least the ways in which artificial intelligence could be used. So that's one way in which we talk about artificial intelligence. This is what Heather said of use cases. And then the flip side of it is generative AI, which is distinct from this. So this is what you would see in terms of large language models that Ziv mentioned. So ChatGPT, images or videos, or what I'm personally really worried about, which is audio deepfakes. You've probably heard of deepfakes of images or videos of people saying things that they didn't otherwise say. My real concern for this space is audio deepfakes, because if you tune into the radio and there's an audio deepfake of somebody saying something that they didn't otherwise say, it's much harder to verify than it is images. So,
yeah, I would say there's been really very solid definitions of AI provided already, so I won't harm on that or continue to ask that. But I think audio is something I'm also very interested in, just particularly in regions where traditional literacy is low. I think that African countries in particular have had instances of or more susceptible to disinformation and per audio and visual sources of generative AI produced content. So I think this is a big issue. We've already seen cases in Gabon, and this actually happened before ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion and these other popular generative AI models came out. And so I think it's really interesting to see how it will impact elections across the continent this year. There was also a case in Nigeria last year about a faked conversation between one of the presidential candidates, Peter Obi, and a bishop. And this happened basically very close to, or I think a bit after the election happened or right before it happened. And so I think, but it was hard to actually understand if the audio was faked or not. There's a lot of discourse on Twitter. I still actually haven't been able to verify if this was a fake audio conversation, but it did have lots of implications for the election alongside the this general disruption of democracy that many of the presidential candidates engaged in. And so I think this is something that should be actively explored and also understand how this differs between global South and global North context.
Well, if you don't mind, let me just follow up on that thread a little bit. We've now got this, this idea that audio deepfakes are a particularly potent form of disinformation or misinformation, especially in contexts where literacy rates for access to visual media might be low. So one question, I know you can't generalize this, but you can take cases. One question is, who's paying for this? Where are the shops where these kinds of products are being produced? What arrangements have to be made for them to be disseminated in a public way by radio or by WhatsApp or by however they are? What's the relationship between the producers of this kind of AI generated content and those who contract for it or benefit from it? And then finally, what are the countermeasures? I mean, I think one of the real terrifying ironies is that sometimes one suspects that jumping up and down and yelling, that's not real, might just draw more attention to disinformation, whether it's a deep fake or whether it's just somebody yelling on a soapbox. And so, can you walk us through? We don't have to limit ourselves to this particular case of audio deep fakes in the context of African elections. We can expand, but to take that as our jumping off point, walk us through the life cycle of a chunk of AI generated, disinformation from its birth to its, its life to its, to its being or not being identified.
Great, I mean, sort of jump on it in terms of countermeasures, and then I'm really curious to hear from Steve. Like, I want to know what sort of efficacy you found in these kinds of interventions and responding to information. One of the things that I do know is that you don't want to repeat the disinformation or the conspiracy theory that individuals have subscribed to. I mean, as humans, we're incredibly fallible. So even when you try to have a lot of these debunking or pre-bunking mechanisms on social media, really what you want to try and do is just avoid at all costs repeating, hey, there was this misinformation or disinformation rumor circulating, that's not true, X, Y, and Z, because really what it does is it just reinforces individuals' cognitive biases. My own research doesn't really engage with that. I think my view of the space, and I think it's incredibly important, but a lot of it has just been almost this game of whack-a-mole in terms of trying to deal with disinformation and putting out fires. So a lot of my work looks at trying to curate targeted educational campaigns based on big data analytics. So that's individuals' likes, their Google searches, their posts, and so on, to curate it in a way that resonates really precisely with that individual and tries to advocate for things like respect for human rights, toleration, and restraint. I think a lot of the well-intended interventions in this space has been to do things like deprioritize toxic content so it doesn't appear as high up on your social media feed, debunking or disputing. We saw a lot of that during the COVID-19 crisis, where a little bubble would appear on your social media feed and say, this is being debated by third-party fact checkers, maybe take it with a grain of salt. Of course, deleting hate speech and then deplatforming repeat offenders, and that's really important. But I think for me, what we really need to be paying more attention to is how we can sort of flood the information ecosphere with positive content based on individuals' big data that really tries to resist it before it takes hold. But I want to throw it over to Zeev to talk about the efficacy of the interventions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few things before I get to efficacy is, one, the way that we think about the risks of sort of generative AI is relative risk. So a couple weeks ago, it was reported in The Economist that Tristan Harris, who works for a center that focuses on tech, thought that he sort of had he was going to dunk on Mark Zuckerberg at a meeting in the White House and show that generative AI could be used to identify potential or develop potential bio threats. And Mark Zuckerberg's response was, look, we can find exactly the same information on Google. And I think that that's sort of an illustrative example of, we need to think about this in terms of relative threats, especially in the sort of election disinformation space. Generative AI is not creating election disinformation. So the question is, what is it good at that might introduce new threats? And the second is that generative AI, and this is where we start to think about the sort of large literature on interventions on social media, is that it doesn't have a distribution mechanism. So essentially what social media did was drop or lower the cost of distributing information to nearly zero, which was very politically impactful, but there was still cost to producing that information. And what we're seeing with generative AI is essentially that it's dropping the cost of producing that information to not zero, but to near zero. In terms of, right, so when we think of the life cycle, somebody goes to a technology like 11 Labs, which is an audio generator. It's very, very cheap to do. You can train on somebody's voice in just a couple minutes of an audio file, and then you can actually feed in text and then create sort of an audio file from, sort of text to speech. Some places like ChatGPT, OpenAI, which have a sort of text to speech API, they don't allow you to train on voices. Places like 11 Labs do. So it's very, very easy and cheap to do, and now you need to distribute it across social media. So totally agree with a number of the interventions that you identified. I think that flooding the zone is great. I think that there's been a lot of work done on inoculation, which is sort of teaching people the strategies that disinformation actors will use so that they can identify when they might witness sort of disinformation campaigns generally, but not trying to play whack-a-mole with individual pieces of disinformation. We've seen some efficacy and good experiments that like out in the field, though I think, still like the actual like coefficient estimates, they're just small, right? I mean, they're significant, but they're small. I think largely this will be put back onto social media platforms to go into their toolkit of things that we actually know works, things like deplatforming repeat offenders, having really sort of robust systems of like human annotators and people in trust and safety teams who can respond to civil society and governments who are flagging really sort of high impact examples. Unfortunately, though, we've seen the exact opposite, which is trust and safety teams at these tech platforms have largely been de-resourced in recent years in contexts like the US, let alone contexts that were already under-resourced throughout the global majority. So I'm not terribly optimistic because I think that the sort of intervention efficacy that we see that sort of is on the margins, right? It sort of assumes that people will see the info, all that stuff, even stuff where we've seen significant findings like with inoculation, it's just really small sort of coefficient estimates. And so I think we need to stop people from seeing it, and that falls on platforms.
Yeah, a few points I want to highlight is with deepfakes, and I try to make this point whenever it comes up, is that deepfake videos, the biggest target are pornographic, non-consensual images of women. And so once that's shared, you can't take it back. It's already out there. And you see this across the world. It's quite easy to create deepfakes. I was looking up research on deepfakes, and what popped up were deepfake generators on Google. Just go to the website, you can do it. And the negative implications this has for communities, if we're talking about elections, the impact on marginalized groups' participation in public life as well as political processes. And so there was an example that was provided on an expert's testimony for Congress of a woman journalist in India who was covering Modi was the target of deepfakes, and how that trauma and pressure on journalism and women who are trying to report on election processes, political processes. And so I just want to put that out there for awareness of the need to combat it, deepfakes broadly, but also the way it targets marginalized people, particularly women, and what the implications could be for electoral processes in that regard. Another thing I've been trying to track is where you see female politicians, like in the case of the Mexico elections, whether you're seeing any online targeted in a gendered way, talking about them and what are the implications of that. In terms of combating it, I say this half jokingly, but it actually worked, was Taylor Swift's fans. When there were deepfakes of Taylor Swift tied to her relationship with an American football player, because the images were connected to that, her fans mobilized spontaneously, flooded X with other images of Taylor Swift, reported it en masse to X. they took it down and then had a period in which no one could search Taylor Swift's name on X. And that was an example in which there wasn't a government intervention. It were fans who did it. And they responded not because the European Union said we're gonna attack your profits and you're gonna face these repercussions. It were fans. And so in terms of response, if there are ways to mobilize people in that regard, and use these platforms to help combat the negative images, speech that are on them, I think that's a positive path to pursue.
Great, yes, I just want to go back briefly to the life cycle and production of this, generated disinformation. There was a really interesting case that happened in January in New Hampshire before the primaries with the generated robocall of Biden urging voters not to vote in the elections. And I read the expose about like how the robocall was actually produced, and it was very like laughable in a way because a political consultant paid a street magician $150 to produce the call, and the consultant or the magician actually went through the process with the reporter and showed how they did it. And so I think that this has lots of implications both for like domestic and international context, just understanding like how fast or easy it is to produce this kind of content as well. And then also there was a recent case with in the Croatian elections last year where the president or one of the candidates' voice was also faked, but also the audio content spread fast or widely on Facebook just because Meta did not have content moderation policies for deepfake audio content. And so I think this is also like a very big implication in how platforms themselves have to, build robust policies against disinformation and also ways to limit the spread. I think what Twitter did, in terms of limiting searches on Taylor Swift is very helpful, but we've seen how people can get around some of these safeguards, particularly in terms of like hacking or like red teaming, ChatGPT or other kinds of text generation platforms. And I'm sure this could be done, through searches for media platforms. And so we really have to figure out the best ways to one, I would say like limit the creation of this generated disinformation, and then also to limit its spread.
Just want to say one thing, you used the term red teaming, let me see if you could define that for people who may not be aware of it.
Sure. Yeah. So red teaming is basically, I guess, I don't have the perfect definition for it, but it can be seen as a way to basically hack different systems. It's been mainly used for text to text, I would say generation platforms in order to understand the use cases or ways that they fail, particularly in ways, like you can generate harmful or negative content. And this is, I would say, Roman Sherry. She runs Humane AI. She's been very adamant in having these like red teaming hackathons, particularly in government, to help different actors and also, the producers or the owners of these generative AI platforms understand how people are able to kind of use backdoors and ways to produce content that may violate their terms of service or just like generate content that is unexpected in ways that these platforms may have tried to prevent them.
I think a really beautiful example of how damaging the audio deepfakes can be is actually, I think it was in the 1940s in London, where over the radio of the BBC, somebody was just reading out the book of War of the Worlds. And if you've not read it, it's about essentially an alien invasion. And of course, people weren't tuning in at the start of reading the book, and they tuned in kind of halfway through. And it caused widespread panic and chaos because people thought that these aliens were coming to London, and so just I think that's kind of what I'm worried about is like when people actually join into it. So you've got the robocalls, where it's really targeted, and there's other scams of people who maybe don't have the same amount of digital literacy. So like elderly people getting voicemails of simulated content of their grandchildren saying, "Grandma, like I'm in America and I need money because I've gotten into a car crash and send money." So really targeting these vulnerable populations. This is a little bit spicy and kind of showing my philosopher hat. If anybody wants me to talk about this, I will. I have written on arguing for using deepfakes for atrocity prevention. So I think that there are actually ways in which we could controversially use this kind of generative AI as a way of stymieing the commission of things like war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansings and genocides. And then I have another piece called The Responsibility to Deceive, and that's arguing the case for, I call them atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns. And I sort of developed a typology of what that could look like. So it's a bit controversial, I'm sort of showing my philosopher hat here, but I do think that there are ways in which we can use this disinformation. But I had a question for yourself. You said that you had done some work in India, and I know that we can't talk about the global south as a sort of homogenous entity, but I would love to hear a little bit more about how some of these global south countries are viewing AI governance.
Sure. I'll talk specifically more to the African context just because that's what I work in now. I didn't do specific governance related information or research during my PhD on India, but I think that there was talks previously about, how I would say, deepfakes have affected Indian female journalists. And I think this goes to like implications around privacy and how these notions really differ between so like majority world and global north context, particularly, women in India, especially when they're operating on social platforms are less likely actually to like post pictures of themselves and also like just use maybe like stock images or just other images for like their profile pictures, for example, just because this risk of deep fakes is very high. And then also in African context, when we think about governance as well, I think there's been like different approaches, particularly from the EU versus like the US, where human rights are kind of the focus of AI governance. I think that African countries are particularly focused on like AI governance in ways that can improve economies, also, and not to say like, the EU, US are not focused on this as well, but also really trying to understand how it can improve opportunity for residents throughout their respective countries, just because there are, really pressing issues that are, I would say affecting these countries, particularly as it pertains to, youth unemployment, lack of access to healthcare, education, et cetera. And I think that, these, I guess the way that, they are positing like how AI can be helpful in these ways is encouraging to a certain extent. But I think that it's really important for African governments to focus on how they can both enable effective AI governance while also working to address traditional development challenges. Just because you can't use AI in education or in hospitals if you don't have effective education systems or healthcare systems and facilities. And so I think it's really important to not kind of fall into the AI hype and understand how AI can be realistically used in these contexts, and then also ensure that governance is focused on ensuring that outside actors, particularly given like the high adoption rate of ChatGPT and other technologies, and their responsible use is enforced, and then also local innovation aligns with responsible development of AI as well.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So one of the things I noticed in US documents that have come out, like the executive order on AI safety and security, is that it provides carve-outs for the national security and intelligence communities. Have you noticed that in Africa in terms of discussions about governance that on the surface, it looks really great, but then you're like, what are these national security agencies doing with all these capabilities?
Yeah, definitely. I think that I've seen less of a focus on national security, and I think that just, and I'm not, like a political scientist or economist, but I think that not to say like African countries are less worried about this, but again, I think it's really focused on like how can AI be used to improve their economic outcomes and social outcomes, for their citizens and residents. And so also I am very kind of iffy about how the US, for example, uses or has talked or discussed about AI, particularly for national security and defense and all that, because I actually believe that AI should not be used for many legal and warfare contexts. And so if there's not, again, a lot of transparency about how AI is being used, or we're also actively seeing AI being used to exacerbate and enable genocide. And so I think that's the biggest issue I have with this. And we see for example, OpenAI remove clauses in their policies about how their tools can be used for military use cases or war and defense use cases. So I think this is a really big issue overall.
Okay, well, I have another question for the panelists. Since both of you have mentioned military applications, another area I was interested in was surveillance. And so just seeing whether all the panelists could just discuss how they have seen it used in either case, surveillance or military application, and to the extent of the example implications for people on the ground who are suffering in these conflict environments or potential political violence, at least in elections.
Then we'll go for it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, clearly coordinated beforehand. So I think there are two ways that I think about AI and surveillance. One of them is in the military practices that I sort of briefly mentioned. So with Lavender, the surveillance mechanisms that are being used to feed into that artificial intelligence system is all kinds of data points, often just including demographics, so like age, gender, location. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a resonance of male equals militant, which is incredibly damaging, but also just behavioral. So again, the sort of extent of surveillance practices means that you can just get a bit of an idea of people's behaviors. And this has been a long time practice, especially within drone warfare and the worry there as you get into lethal autonomous weapons. But just sort of parking that for a second, I'm sure you can speak more to that. One of the things that the social media companies have been doing for a very long time is to abide by this policy that is kind of referred to as no insides on the outside. So they don't want gratuitous or gruesome content on their platforms. Sounds great, right? But what they do is they use artificial systems to scour their platforms and then automatically delete anything that they think is in violation of this community standard or this policy, which sounds great, but for years, there was a brilliant Human Rights Watch report that came out in 2020 that said that these social media companies, as a result of these artificial intelligence systems that are surveilling their platforms, have been deleting evidence of war crimes. And
This is it was called content not found, right?
video unavailable.
Yeah, video unavailable.
Exactly. So it was a report that came out in 2020 by Human Rights Watch, which was sort of sounding the alarm for this. And there's a brilliant scholar just down the road from where I am at Stanford. She's at Berkeley doing some work on digital evidence lockers, as well as sort of trying to campaign for these social media companies to be like, look, we get that you don't want gratuitous content on the platform. People don't want to be scrolling through the sort of doomsday of all of these really awful content, but it can be really helpful for transitional justice processes after the fact. So you need to have these digital evidence lockers in place. There was a report by the BBC in May of last year, again finding that these social media companies and their artificial intelligence systems are deleting evidence of war crime in Ukraine. And so citizens are uploading this content and it's just being deleted. So I think that this is a powerful way in terms of how artificial intelligence could be used to identify content, and rather than just like control deleting it, actually putting it into a system that could be used for justice after the fact. Oh, no.
So this, I think, sort of builds on the question around surveillance, which is just thinking about like how the capacity for AI to do large scale classification very quickly. I think there are some applications, especially in military contexts or contexts that align with what discussed yesterday. I know that Homeland Security and ICE are using AI to sort of identify people here in the US in really sort of tragic and inhumane ways. The same set of technologies, though, can be used for content classification in potentially really pro-democratic ways. So I recently had a meeting at the UN with a group, a small group of very good and sort of mighty data scientists who were working. There was 6 of them. They were covering all UN missions globally, and working with UN missions on the ground to try to ingest multimodal data, media data, everything from social media data to television data, to like, there was, in certain contexts, they had set up Raspberry Pis to like be able to collect audio data from like local radio and ingest that. And the question was, okay, great, we've just ingested all this data. How do we help missions actually make sense of it? And right now, the current solution is you have lots of people who would be better used doing other stuff, who are sitting there annotating data. And this is one application of AI that potentially is really, really helpful, for political violence or protecting against political violence or identifying speech that might be able to lead to political violence, but also just sort of much broader applications. And AI seems to be very, very good at that. And it seems to be, we were chatting about it. It seems to be good at it in many languages, not quite good enough in some languages, though it's actually like pretty remarkable how good it is in a number of languages. And when I say remarkable, like even the people who are developing these technologies are surprised that it's as good as it is in a number of languages. And it's really good at multimodal. So, you could feed it in a meme and be able to ask, could this meme, have these risk categories? Could it potentially lead to political violence? And you're not gonna get a perfect signal, but you're gonna get a signal. And so there are some interesting sort of pro-democratic use cases that like essentially do the same thing as like really negative surveillance, but in a way that if we give this to sort of civil society or NGOs, might be able to be quite positive.
I have a question for Heather. Are there any guardrails on how the DHS uses this data mining and surveillance practices of AI that you can tell us about?
So they're working on it right now. So Homeland Security released publicly an AI roadmap. That it was a rollout. They spoke to the New York Times, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And so what they have been also considering, because it's the largest law enforcement agency in the government, in the federal government, which also became more apparent after George Floyd's murder, in which we were looking at all the law enforcement capacities of the federal government. And if you dig deep enough, which is what I did years ago, is you'd be surprised about how many government agencies have a law enforcement entity tied to it to enforce. Like the Postal Service has an enforcement mechanism, an investigative aspect of it. And so with Homeland Security, it outlines that they're considering responsible use applications. And some of this is outlined within the Office of Management and Budget tied to the executive branch in the White House that released a memo saying this is what responsible use is. This is how you have to conduct constant test evaluation and monitoring of your AI systems. And so it's shifting the conversation to say AI systems should be safe, going to a point that you made earlier, to the application of AI. And so I liken this to capitalism on its own doesn't do anything. It's the people within the system who help dictate where is it going to go, how is it going to be built, and you could consider the same with AI. And so in the case of Homeland Security, they're following along with the guidance coming out of the White House. Keep in mind, this isn't stuff built into legislation. So it's different. So you could have another administration come in and rewrite the rules of how AI should be used. So that's something to pay attention to within an election year, is what a next administration would do in terms of how the federal government, law enforcement agencies use artificial intelligence and apply it, whether it's domestically or internationally, because these agencies do operate internationally, have a presence in various countries, and interact with law enforcement in other countries. And to go back to the election aspect, I would just say what I'm paying attention to, at least for the United States, is there's been coverage online of election monitors building up their capacity and potentially arming themselves to monitor how Americans are going to vote, to make sure nothing illegal takes place. And so that's a big concern in terms of thinking about that and how law enforcement would respond and the chaos that can result. And so in thinking about the US, it's not just thinking about AI applications, it's just how people are communicating on social media, building up this capacity. That happened in some coverage around January 6th, that there was a Facebook group and all these people signed up for it and received information of coordinated action. And so that looking at how just people are engaging with each other on social media, you don't even need generative AI to do that, to understand what are the risks within an election environment.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Heather made a good point, in terms of just like the interconnectedness of, you know, in terms of how, like, the US has defense or security agencies that operate abroad. I think it's also really, interesting just to understand, you know, like, for example, cops or police departments from LA, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, actually, you know, like go to the IDF to receive training. And and also like, and how these technologies actually trickle down, and are spread from Israel in particular to, you know, these defense agencies, excuse me, and military agencies, or police departments. And I think this is really important to understand, like, why there has to be robust, let's say, like, robust responses and also protections against understanding how like AI and also just like other technologies can be used to enable you know, or impact, like, you know, citizens in different ways. And I think also there was a report recently released, I can't remember the exact name, but it talks about how African countries in particular are adopting surveillance technologies from places, again, like Israel, UK, US, Canada, for example. And I think it's important to understand that, you know, early on, you know, facial recognition was shown to perform very poorly on Black faces. And also these technologies are being adopted from China as well. I think this also has very, you know, just like geopolitical implications in terms of how African countries, you know, can kind of like fall into the whims or, you know, I would say like, adopt the values of these countries that may negatively impact their respective citizens. And so surveillance is a big issue everywhere, but I think that is, there's also, again, not a lot of transparency in these governments about, you know, how they're actively tracking citizens, you know, where the efficacy rates of these technologies are adopting, you know, how much money is going, you know, to pay or being paid for these technologies. And, you know, again, like what are the general implications for, you know, like African consumers, citizens, populations, just because a lot of the AI ethics research or literature is really focused on Western context. So for example, in many, like, again, like race is a, you know, Western construct, and in many African countries, you know, they are racially, quote unquote, homogenous. And so it's really important to understand that there are other factors like religion or tribe and like gender and the intersections of these that play like, you know, much more important roles versus, you know, whether someone is Black or white, again, which may not apply in countries like Nigeria, for example. In South Africa, you know, this is maybe a different story, but again, like, this is just like a very small percentage of the population.
Yeah, I just want to point out, based on different points that are coming to me from what the panelists said, is you have already political campaigns in different parts of the world using AI to help engage with voters. There was the example in Pakistan of the candidate being in jail and using AI. You have it also in Mexico of one of the candidates using an AI avatar to help communicate with voters. And then, of course, in India, you have people affiliated or supportive of Modi's party, but also part of the cultural environment creating AI-generated videos of Modi and sort of feeding into this narrative that he is the savior of India and helping to advertise him for the election campaign, as well as the build-up, at least for some experts, and I'm not a India expert, of this cult of personality around him. And so I think for 2024, even though you're not going to, at least in my opinion, you're not going to see the whole like groundswell of generative AI taking over elections, you are getting insights in terms of how it's going to be used by politicians, political campaigns in different parts of the world, and the implications for the future. Because I think where people come down and vote will set the course of what governance of AI will be for at least for the rest of this decade. And so the importance of how people are voting in 2024 is, in addition to the domestic context, it's how countries are going to engage with companies, with international institutions, and within their own multilateral networks of how you're going to engage in responsible use of AI, its applications in military environments, surveillance, or even more positive uses in elections, a way it may be easier to communicate with voters in ways that it wasn't possible or as easy in the past.
Yeah, so I think this application to campaigns using it as part of like their tech stack is really interesting. I recently read something that referred to this as soft fakes, which like, oh yeah, which I'll use that terminology, but it's a really interesting normative question, which is like, is this an acceptable use of AI? You know, one of the places where we're seeing it is candidates using AI to make it seem as if they're speaking a language that they don't know. On the one hand, you can imagine this sort of like, or the like sort of positive outcome of this, which is that they're able to communicate with a different set of voters. On the other hand, they don't speak a certain language, right? So is this acceptable or not? And you can imagine this sort of aligning with certain dynamics around elections in both really positive and really sort of negative or harmful ways. I think that there's something that you brought up at the end, which is I think really important to pause on, which is like especially around elections, there's going to need to be communication between academics, civil society orgs, NGOs, governments, and these companies. And right now, there's a small set of companies that sort of have had the capital to be able to train these models, to be able to engage them on like what are acceptable uses of AI. So this is a sort of a question for you all, which is, have you engaged with these companies? And what has your sort of experience been? We don't need to name names. I'm just curious, right? Because if it comes to sort of accountability and getting in front of some of these issues, there's just this human quality to it, which is like somebody picking up a phone or writing an email and having someone respond to it. So I'm curious what the sort of nature of your engagements have been and how that changes or doesn't change the way that you think about some of these election related risks.
Yeah, in January in DC, Google hosted their like vice president of search, and he was having some kind of like just basically kind of like I don't know, touring a tour about Google's search capabilities and also how generative AI like impacts that. Now that was really interesting because they mentioned how they're using content moderators to kind of help filter through their searches. But then actually like a week later, it was released in the news that they basically ended their contract with, I think it was Atlassian or Appian, the firm that they used to subcontract like this labor to. And also there wasn't a lot of, I would say, transparency in terms of like where these workers or content moderators are distributed, and also in terms of like, how familiar they are with content, let's say like that, pertains to the global majority or like, places outside of the US. And I think that this has been interesting just thinking about the scale of data work and content moderation, labor export already. Just knowing that these companies have really relied on global South, global majority workers to label and moderate their respective content. And then also understanding that these workers are also in very precarious conditions that limit their ability to actually, do their work very well because of the like high load that they have from these companies. And so I think that Google or just the tech companies in general, have or they aim to have very good intentions, but I think that they're falling really short in ways that I would say is basically unacceptable because they have their resources to do better. And so yeah, that's
Yeah, maybe this is just my naivety when I moved from Australia to Stanford to do some more field work. So my book is based on a bunch of interviews with cyber subject matter experts, so folks over at US Cyber Command and the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, and then a bunch of humanitarian folks, so based out of the UN and Stimson Center, Global RTP Center, etc. And I didn't get to chat with the big tech companies, so I was like, oh, this would be great. I'll just go to Silicon Valley and have fun chats with like the big tech companies about how they can help prevent genocide. Yeah, it was news to me. And so I gave up pretty quickly because as soon as you mentioned the G word, people just shut down. I know that others in the audience, Christina and Ernesto, have had infinitely more success with this, or maybe it's just a me thing. But one of the pieces of, I think what that showed me is that these big tech companies, I mean, they don't have the same kind of democratic accountability or transparency expectations that we have when it comes to the United Nations or even governments. So they don't owe it to me to have chats about how their platforms could help limit online content leading to offline harms in the same way that these other democratic organizations do. And so for me, this is something that you had raised before, this has even more complexity when it comes to transparency and who are making these decisions. So this is in the pre-Musk era, but during the Taliban retakeover, I was looking at the Taliban spokespersons on Twitter, and one of the Taliban spokespersons had more followers on Twitter than my prime minister in Australia. And I was like, okay, what explains this? Like, Twitter has these very explicit policies around not allowing violent extremists on their platforms. And so I went to their policies. Again, this is the pre-Musk era. It's gotten worse since then. And they said, yeah, no, we don't allow violent extremist organizations or incitement to violence on our platforms, except, and then listed, things like if they're undergoing peace negotiations, my question is with whom, if they are a ruling party or a government, okay, who decides that? And at no point was there any sort of transparency around how these decisions were being made at Twitter, at least not public facing. So I think the big thing for me is that I just haven't been able to penetrate into that space, and admittedly I gave up pretty quickly because to me it was more alarming that these corporations are making incredibly profound decisions that affect billions of users, and we don't understand how or why. And as you said, a lot of the accountability human rights teams have been gutted in recent times.
During my time at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I had challenges when I contacted them to get a response. And when I was able to meet someone and they'd be like, oh, yeah, U.S. Institute of Peace, that sounds interesting, let's set up a time. And then they would give me their card and then I would respond back and they wouldn't respond. But in addition to engaging directly with the companies, it's the industry groups. And so I was able to engage more effectively with the industry groups who are represented, amalgamation of the companies. And some of them are now tied up with Supreme Court cases and making arguments before the Supreme Court represented the technology companies' interests or social media companies' interests. And so I will also pay attention to that as the industry groups that are around. It kind of reminds me of in the past with big tobacco and oil companies where they fund research that you may not necessarily know the origins of like who paid for it, but that's taken place. Someone told me that the whole idea of media literacy was coming from the social media companies, and people picked up on it and say, let's do media literacy as a solution to what's going on the platforms. Even though I think people have owned aspects of that and come up with other ideas around media literacy, is that type of environment you're dealing with in which you don't know that the solutions that are being put out there are what they want you to focus on instead of others that will actually hold them more accountable.
Can I put your finger on that? Sorry, just a two finger, because I think this is really important to emphasize. When I talk about big tech companies, the majority of the voting decision-making power sits with a handful of cis-het white men in Silicon Valley. So the actual amount of decision-making is with Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Google. It's with Mark Zuckerberg, and obviously Elon Musk now just straight up owns Twitter or X. So when we talk about these big tech companies making decisions, the majority of the decision-making power and the voting capabilities sits with these individuals in a very, very small part of the world and representative of a very, very small component of the world. And I just really want to emphasize that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And what's also interesting about tech companies is like who you can talk to when you pick up the phone or write an email if they do respond. I've had research partnerships with a number of them, and so I've gotten responses, but I think what's been really interesting is who's responding to me. And I think this is actually really important for folks in the audience, especially when you're thinking about trying to engage some of these companies around human rights. Questions is like, where the person sits in the org is really important. It is the case that in terms of like voting power for corporations, it is a small number of like cis white men. When it comes to who can respond and actually take action internally at companies, I've actually been surprised by how much power people have to actually like do good things internally in companies, largely because they're just so large and there tends to be so little like internal oversight over what people do that you can like actually meaningfully like sort of turn knobs in productive ways if you can find the right person. And so what I have found increasingly over recent years, and this is especially true with some of the newer AI companies, is people with the word policy in their title are responding to me. And people with the word policy in their title essentially means that they're lobbyists largely sitting in DC. And those are not the people you want to talk to, because those are the people who don't have any of the knobs to turn. The type of folks who you tend to want to talk to are ones sitting directly on product teams who have oversight into certain product decisions and can meaningfully take action. And so sometimes that was trust and safety teams who would own a particular vertical. Sometimes it was actually product teams who would own stuff like newsfeed or other products like search. Increasingly, those folks are not engaging, and at some of these smaller AI companies like even OpenAI, which has just over 1,000 employees, which is larger than other AI companies, but much smaller than some other places. I've only gotten engagement from folks with the word policy in their title. And so I think that's a pretty strong signal that for a number of reasons, they're not engaging in ways that actually allow us to like flag potentially harmful content, whether it's being produced by AI or distributed on social media, and actually have action taking on it. Because unfortunately the folks at UDC are not the ones who are going to be able to do it. But that's just sort of a flag for folks here if you do engage like Meta and someone with like public policy responds. Unfortunately, you found yourself in the wrong part of the org for actually getting content to
So
do that.
this might be a good time to hear other people's stories about positive, constructive collaboration with social media companies for atrocity prevention. I'm sure we all have them, right? that was the last one. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. We have 20 minutes left. I'd love to get some questions from the audience. I know a bunch of my colleagues here have had a lot of interesting comparable experiences. We'll start with Kate.
I just want to
Oh, yes.
on a point that you made and that we were talking about earlier is your experience on the research aspect, because that came up yesterday on the capacity of people in different countries to conduct the research necessary to understand the online environment fully.
And also how much data they hand over. If you are lucky to get the companies to hand over a section of data to do research, like they don't tell you how much of the pie you're getting or what the decisions were made in terms of how they came to that. They just give you a whole bunch of data and be like, have fun, and you don't know if that's a representative sample or not.
Yeah, so at a very high level, there are 3 ways to get data from tech companies. Tech companies can just decide to sort of hand over data. Twitter used to be very, very good at this. We used to be able to get tons of Twitter. That's no longer the case. Places like Facebook, they just de-resourced CrowdTangle. They have something called the Meta Content Library, which seems to be just essentially a strictly worse version of CrowdTangle. And then if you look at a bunch of the other social media platforms, we just get far less data. So that's one, which is that they can voluntarily hand over data. The second is we can get governments to compel them to hand over data. What's sort of, I think, great about this is in any markets where like tech platforms wouldn't want to exit, which is most markets, especially if you have like multinational institutional decision-making or regulatory authority, then you can essentially compel tech companies to hand over very, very broad data. We're seeing this right now with DSA in Europe. I'm really hoping that other contexts or other countries sort of follow suit and sort of use this actually as sort of a plug and play model for the type of data that we might be able to get from platforms. And then finally, we can engage in research partnerships with tech companies, which I think can be a really powerful mechanism for doing very tailored and narrow research that unfortunately is largely relationship driven. So if you know people there, which tends to be if you are like an American or like our like top 20 university or Oxbridge, then this works. Otherwise, this has not worked. So I think that we've gotten some really important research outputs out of these partnerships, but they are very, very limited. And this is coming from somebody who has engaged in a number of these research partnerships. And so I don't think that this is actually sort of a model that we want to be generalizable. So I would, I do spend a lot more of my energy focusing on how do we make the first two a lot broader so that folks both in academic and non-academic context can get access to data. And this is the last point that I'll make, which is really important, is one of the things that we're seeing, which I think is unfortunate, is both in terms of data share, like voluntary data sharing arrangements from places like Meta, and in terms of data sharing mandates that are codified in law, often researchers are being classified as people attached to universities. And so what we saw with CrowdTangle from Meta is that anyone who was considered a researcher, whether you were sort of a journalist or a civil society or an academic, you could get data. Unfortunately, we're moving in a direction where we're sort of creating these walled gardens where academics can like have rich data resources, but not other folks. And so I want to sort of flag that as like a lot of the rules are being written now. And so this is sort of the time to engage before they really do get codified and sort of lock out important actors from having access to these really rich data.
Sorry, we went rogue. Sorry.
So, so let's take some questions from the audience, and then, even though we all come to know each other, if you could just identify yourselves before your questions, I'll get to you second.
Thank you. I'm Kate. We probably all hung out yesterday. I'm with Protection Approaches in London. This conversation is just extraordinary. I think we could just listen and listen. I kind of wanted to test a bit of a theory with you. To me, it feels as if in atrocity prevention or violence prevention more broadly, there's been a kind of trend, and I'm speaking now primarily in thinking about foreign policy or development responses from global north states, particularly the UK actually, and then we've sort of exported what I'm going to talk about a little bit unhelpfully around the world, of having a communications-based response to major political crises. This sense that when you see communications-based strategies coming from malign actors, the assumption is then that we need a communications-based response to that. It's something that Tony Blair really kind of embedded in his time in office and established a kind of communications cell in the heart of the Foreign Office called RICU. So things like the counter-narrative strategies that emerged in response to violent extremism, particularly violent Islamist extremism. And it kind of spawned this non-human rights grey area of actors, of essentially corporates, often places like Saatchi World Services, people that were very good at comms, but in fact were used to selling Volvos rather than preventing violence. And I think over the last sort of 20 years, we've kind of observed this trajectory of a communications-based response to political violence that is not necessarily very effective. We now know that the counter-narrative entire endeavor did far more harm than it did good. But then as it's evolved, and this is the kind of theory I want to test, because maybe my interpretation of the lineage isn't correct, we've then sort of seen this evolution that's kind of now bringing in a fascination with new tech and information gathering, like on say, kind of open source bros who have now come in and they've got these companies, and they're not for profit, right? They are not charitable endeavors. These are corporates that are making a lot of money. And I worry that this is now the new era of information and communications-based harm will then drive a new era of corporate responses to essentially political harm. And it's displaced those traditional endeavors that have always worked, like media development, really good media literacy, these things that used to fund, the BBC World Service now goes, that has now been cut, and we now, pay PR firms to do it. So I just wanted to test whether you feel that actually, as we need to respond to these information-based threats, we're missing both the offline harm and the offline solutions that are always going to be rooted in people feeling less safe. And that actually those companies that come in their blue suits and their very shiny slide decks are going to continue to drive and displace the legitimacy of the very simple knowledge of people who are proximate to violence. So I just does that track as a kind of lineage of concern? Can you talk a little bit about that landscape of the actors that are beginning to step in from a preventative perspective, or pretending to, or might, or actually am I just being a bit of a Luddite and being more worried than I need to be? Thank you.
I mean, I can have a crack at that first, kind of pivoting to an analog space. So just prior to the 2001 intervention in Afghanistan, the US started to drop leaflets in really rural parts of the country to sort of justify their presence there, right? They were dropping leaflets to farmers in mountains of Afghanistan to sort of explain why these men in green combat suits were there. And the leaflets had two pictures on them. One was of the Twin Towers being hit, and then another was a dove with an olive branch in its mouth. And obviously, to a bunch of folks in 2001 in Afghanistan, they were like, I don't know what this building is and what's up with this bird. Like, it didn't communicate. It didn't resonate with that population. One of the promises that I think new technologies has, and maybe this is a bit of an optimistic approach, is we can tailor make the messaging precisely drawing on grassroots activists and individual thought leaders on the ground to curate the messaging in a way that is going to make sense to that population. So it's about leveraging the insights of those on the ground and really amplifying that as a way of counter narratives, as opposed to the sort of top-down Western like projection ideal of this is what peace should look like. I also don't think that this is a silver bullet. Like, I think it's just another tool in the atrocity prevention toolbox that we haven't given that much consideration to, but it definitely points to the need to continue with traditional atrocity prevention mechanisms in place. But I do think that there's something distinct about big data analytics and the kinds of insights that we can glean today.
Yeah, so my training is as a historian. And so I studied the early Soviet period. I started off as a US historian, then switched over to looking at Russia and people from what we now consider the global south, or that term is transition as well, who traveled to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s to see what the big Soviet project was about. And one of the interesting things that I noticed in my research was how the Russian Bolsheviks were put into racism in the US in the 1920s. And we still have not developed an effective response when the Russians do this to us. And that was when they relied on sailors to transport newspapers, the Communist International newspapers, across the world. And so I think part of it, of what you're saying, is just that the underlying aspect of what makes so much polarization or challenges within a society still haven't been addressed. And so we're switching to communication approaches. And I think part of it is tied to a historical aspect of how that idea of segmentation and putting people into groups emerged out of advertising. And so there's a great book called The Consumer's Republic that talks about these changes in business practices coming out of World War II, and how that transformed American society, that you had this large manufacturing base and you became more of a consumer-driven society, retail, service industry, and what that did to the culture. And so that also influenced politics of saying, I need you to appeal to this particular group using the expertise of consultants and advertisers. And I think that has just continued to permeate all aspects of how we engage in messaging. And I think another aspect tied to the conference is thinking about peace building, and whether peace, from my observations at the US Institute of Peace, has evolved with all these changes that are taking place in the world, how people are responding online or engaging online, and whether the approaches we used previously could be applied now, or whether we need to evolve or think differently. And I think that's a broader conversation, and I hope that the peace building community, peacemakers engage in that type of dialogue with a range of experts to better understand and tailor responses that tackles these present issues. So you don't get a communications office that was selling Lobos trying to involve themselves in counterterrorism.
Let's take another question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I believe it was Rhiannon who had mentioned something about using deep fakes to prevent atrocity. And I was just wondering, can you provide examples of how that can be done and how you can prevent an organization from losing its legitimacy in the public eye when those deep fakes are disproven? Oh, hi, and I'm Numa, I'm a student.
Amazing. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Oh, I'm so glad somebody raised this. Yay. Okay, so I think that there are ways in which we can use deepfakes. So one example might be, and I don't support this, but one example could be of Vladimir Putin calling for the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is rife with atrocity crimes being perpetrated. I don't support that precisely because Vladimir Putin is the one person who legitimately could actually call off the war. And so I think that there are certain people who occupy spaces that shouldn't be touched because we want to be able to believe them. So there's a Hannah Arendt quote that I adore, which is to say, it's not that people are going to get to a point where they believe lies, it's that they just don't believe anything at all. And so I think there are particular institutions and particular people who should be off limits. That being said, if you want to have like a mid or low ranked general actually as a deepfake audio or visual to say, hey guys, we're actually going to redirect our troops to this particular part of the country, away from this particular part of the country where they're going to commit war crimes or crimes against humanity, I say why not? Give it a crack. In terms of the disinformation space, so part of the typology could be something like you flood an information space that says, look, I talk about it as trying to render people epistemically worse off, which doesn't include anything like defamation. It's basically just trying to get the perpetrators to stay at home. So an example of this is to say that the road leading to the Rohingya ethnic minority in Myanmar is flooded. You can't get that today. Or, oh, actually, let's pump the brakes. We're waiting for this international delegation to leave the country before we can take up arms. Or we're waiting for a particular weapons shipment to come into the country. And this kind of ties back to what we talked about yesterday with the panel, but you know, if you go through with these crimes, you will be prosecuted at the ICC, there will be punitive measures waged against you. It's kind of weird that I classify that as a disinformation campaign, but when you actually look at the prosecution rates of individual perpetrators, not great. So these are just kind of some of the examples that I talk about in terms of disinformation and also deepfakes in terms of preventing atrocity crimes. And again, the idea is just to prompt perpetrators to think twice about whether it's something they want to go through, buying time for more effective protection mechanisms to take place, and getting perpetrators to stay at home. And you know, a lot of this has in resonance with Cambridge Analytica. I don't support in interfering in elections. People have a right to participate in the democratic process. They don't have a right to participate in genocide.
Okay, questions? So we have, let's just gather two quick questions and then we'll be at time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I very rarely have a space to talk to experts in artificial intelligence and their uses, especially in the humanitarian sector. I've been working with the Data to Safeguard Human Rights Accelerator of J. Patrick Foundation, and also I am a tech and migration monitor from Open Society. I just want to kind of insert myself into the discussion a little bit from a non-tech person that has been diving into this topics for the last 2 years, so I'm still a baby on it. So one of the things that worries me about is like large models or NLPs to be used in, I don't know, cases like Cambridge Analytica in order to perpetrate crimes against humanity and also to surveil people along the border. And one of our worries is like the use of these models who are not being curated enough to not have these iterations of racism and xenophobia to actually provide refuge and approve refuge along the border, and how this can affect the possible implications in communications in the future, because it is very easy to take these models to analyze large data sets of human behavior in social networks in order to create communication strategies to change that are specifically targeted to human behavior. And also develop how do we ensure that we are actually inserting ourselves as experts into the building of ethically building these models to actually counterpart all these things that are being built, or all these technologies that are being built in the private sector for profit.
Yeah, I mean, from my view, like, I think that there's actually, okay, so maybe this is a little controversial. I feel like I'm the black sheep of the family at the moment, but look, I think we can actually learn a lot from advertising. I think that we should be leveraging the insights of marketing companies and advertising precisely because so much of this is psychology, and psychology is universal. I think that it's the ends for which we're using these technologies that we need to be concerned about. Like, I think that there is potential for a lot of these systems to help enable protection mechanisms of those seeking refuge or those along the borders, precisely in the same way that they can be used for harmful ends. So there was a report that was released by Facebook a few years ago that found, again, this is all psychology, but advertisers would be able to target young girls, so like 13, 14, first thing Monday morning with makeup products or hair products, or God forbid, but like, you know, surgical enhancements. And it was because that they found the psychology was when these teenage girls were most susceptible, because that's when they felt vulnerable, worthless, and insecure. So there are ways in which these kinds of like insights into human psychology is being weaponized to sell people products and could be used and abused for bad faith actors and to ill ends. But I also think that there's a positive flip to that, which could enable like the targeting of information to refugees along the borders who really need it in a way that resonates more precisely with them. It's just about who's actually got the money to be able to do this.
Yeah, and I would just say that systems are gonna be around. There's gonna be more experts with capabilities enhancing these systems, contributing to them, thinking of their application. And so we need to think of positive uses and brainstorm ways rather than just saying it's all bad, we're doomed, and moving away from it.
Last closing thoughts, we're out of time. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for their coffee break. We will be back here to start our next panel at 11 o'clock precisely.
Your wedding, we'll be in touch, yeah. I mean, I guess